close your eyes and let the noise of the modern world fade softly into the background. Tonight, we journey back across the centuries, leaving behind the marble monuments and loud echoes of history, to find a quiet man standing in the damp, earthy soil of an 18th century Virginia morning. But before we cross that expanse of time, just allow yourself to settle deeply into where you are resting right now. Notice the gentle rhythm of your own breath, rising and falling like the slow, steady current of an ancient river. Breathe in the quiet of the night, and as you exhale, release the lingering thoughts of the day. If you find yourself drifting off before our story reaches its end, that is perfectly fine. The land will still be there, waiting quietly. Let the soft current of my voice carry you as we travel back to a time of vast, untouched forests and quiet mornings. Imagine the morning mist rolling slowly over the deep green hills of the Tidewater, carrying the faint, crisp scent of pine and damp earth. In this quiet dawn, long before the creation of a new nation, the world was measured not in politics or grand events, but in the changing of the seasons and the slow growth of crops. When we picture the architect of a country, we so often see an unmoving figure cast in bronze or carved into cold white stone. We imagine the heavy weight of history and the loud clashing of empires. Yet beneath all those layers of memory and myth, there was simply a man who found his greatest comfort in the deep silence of the natural world. He was a farmer who carefully sifted the soil through his fingers, feeling the promise of the coming spring, and a surveyor who walked for miles through the quiet isolation of the American wilderness. As you rest, picture him walking softly through a clearing in the woods, his tall frame moving carefully through the tall grass while the morning sun slowly warms the dew on the leaves. He did not seek out the noise of crowded rooms or the complicated demands of leadership. His heart was always rooted in the simple, grounding rhythms of planting and harvesting, listening to the gentle rustle of tobacco leaves and wheat stalks swaying in the warm southern breeze. The life of a colonial planter was tied intimately to the earth, a steady, patient existence where time was measured by the slow, golden turning of the sun. As he stood on the banks of the river, listening to the gentle lapping of the water against the muddy shore, he felt a deep, abiding connection to the land that would shape his journey. History would eventually call upon him to carry an immense burden, asking him to shape the future of a continent and to lead a weary army through freezing winters. But before the banners were raised, and long after the last campfires faded to ash, his true refuge was always the familiar, sweeping curves of the Potomac River, flowing peacefully beside his home. Here in the quiet morning light, there is no urgency, no heavy expectation, and no demanding call to duty. There is only the peaceful sound of the wind moving through the ancient oaks, the quiet settling of an old house, and a man looking out across the water, feeling the profound stillness of a new day beginning. We will slowly trace the quiet path of his life, not as a monument, but as a gentle journey through the fields and forests he loved so dearly. On a cold, frost-covered morning in the late winter of 1732, the story of this quiet man began softly along the gentle, curving banks of Pope's Creek. The world into which he was born was not a place of crowded streets or hurried lives, but a vast, open expanse of Tidewater, Virginia, nestled peacefully between the slow-moving currents of the Potomac and the Rappahannock rivers. In a modest wooden house, warmed by the soft, glowing embers of a heavy hearth fire, the young George drew his first breaths as the winter winds rustled gently through the barren branches of the ancient oak trees outside. There were no grand celebrations or loud announcements, only the quiet, steady continuation of life in a deeply rural landscape, where the passage of time was measured slowly by the waxing and waning of the moon and the gentle turning of the earth. As the earliest years of his childhood gradually unfolded, the young boy grew alongside the slow, patient rhythms of the colonial seasons. The land was flat and endlessly green, dotted with small, distant farmhouses that seemed to sleep under the warm, heavy blankets of the southern sun. His world was deeply intertwined with the fertile, damp soil, surrounded by the vast, quiet wilderness that stretched out infinitely toward the setting sun. When he was just a small boy, the family moved up the river, eventually finding a home at a peaceful riverside property known as Ferry Farm. Here, sitting quietly on the grassy bluffs, he would spend countless hours watching the slow wooden ferries glide effortlessly across the surface of the shimmering water, carrying travelers and gentle ripples toward the distant horizon, while the warm breezes of spring slowly coaxed the sleepy land back into vibrant bloom. His early education did not take place in the rigid, echoing halls of a formal schoolhouse, but rather out under the vast, open canopy of the Virginia sky. His classroom was the soft, damp earth, the sprawling fields of tobacco swaying gently in the summer heat, and the quiet, shady groves where the horses grazed peacefully in the afternoon light. He learned to ride with a slow, effortless grace, feeling the rhythmic, comforting motion of a horse beneath him as they wandered together through the whispering pines. He learned the quiet patience required to plant a seed and wait for the slow, miraculous sprout of green to push its way through the dark soil. He watched the careful, measured labor of the men and women who worked the sprawling plantation, observing the endless, rhythmic cycle of planting, tending, and harvesting that anchored their quiet lives to the turning seasons. When George was just 11 years old, the steady, familiar rhythm of his childhood experienced a quiet, solemn shift. His father, Augustine, a gentle, grounded man who had taught him to read the land, passed peacefully from the world. This moment of loss was not marked by sharp, piercing tragedy, but rather felt like the quiet, inevitable fading of autumn into the deep stillness of winter. Like the heavy oak leaves releasing their gentle grip on the branches to float softly to the forest floor, his father's passing was a solemn, natural turning of the season that brought a profound sense of quiet responsibility to the young boy. In the hushed days that followed, the house grew quieter, and George found deep, comforting solace in the silent embrace of the dense, protective forests and the steady, unbroken flow of the gentle river beside his home. While other young men of his standing were soon packing their trunks to cross the vast rolling ocean, sailing toward the loud, crowded universities of England, George remained softly tethered to the familiar soil of Virginia. The quiet passing of his father meant that the resources for a classical education simply were not there, gently closing one door while softly opening another. There were no long hours spent memorizing ancient Greek or studying loud, complicated philosophies in drafty stone rooms. Instead, he entered a quiet, reflective period of observation. He spent his days walking slowly through the meadows, absorbing the profound, silent wisdom of the natural world. He practiced his writing by copying rules of quiet civility and gentle behavior into his notebooks, his quill scratching softly against the heavy, coarse paper while the afternoon light slowly faded into a warm, golden dusk. In the gentle, lingering wake of his father's passing, his older half-brother Lawrence emerged as a steady, comforting presence, offering a warm and guiding light for the quiet young man. Lawrence lived miles away on a beautiful, peaceful estate that overlooked the sweeping bends of the Potomac River, a serene and beautiful property named Mount Vernon. Lawrence gently invited his younger brother to spend long, restful weeks and months within the welcoming walls of his home, escaping the busy, crowded chores of Ferry Farm. George found himself embraced by a world of quiet refinement and gentle learning. The days at Mount Vernon drifted by in a slow, peaceful haze of comforting warmth. Lawrence became not just a brother, but a quiet mentor and a kind, surrogate father, walking alongside George through the shaded gardens and speaking softly of the wider, distant world beyond the river. Through Lawrence, the young George was introduced to the neighboring Belvoir estate, where the wealthy Fairfax family welcomed him into their elegant, warmly lit parlors. The atmosphere here was incredibly soothing, filled with the soft glow of candlelight reflecting gently off polished silver and delicate china. He sat quietly, listening to the soft murmur of polite conversation, observing the effortless, gentle grace with which these people moved through the world. He learned to dance, finding a natural, rhythmic harmony as he glided softly across the polished wooden floors, moving in time with the gentle melodies of violins playing late into the warm, fragrant evenings. In these quiet, comfortable rooms, surrounded by the faint scent of beeswax candles and blooming magnolias, The young boy from Fairy Farm slowly blossomed, absorbing the quiet dignity and the peaceful, grounded strength that would gently carry him forward into the long, unwritten chapters of his life. As the quiet days of his youth gently folded into one another, the young George found himself drawn toward the distant, hazy blue peaks of the western horizon. Through the warm, guiding influence of the Fairfax family, a new and expansive path slowly opened before him, leading away from the polished wooden floors of the Tidewater parlors and out into the vast, untouched embrace of the Shenandoah Valley. He was just 16 years old when he first joined a small, quiet surveying party, riding slowly into a profound wilderness that seemed to stretch on forever under the boundless Virginia sky. The journey was not rushed, but rather a slow, deliberate passage through ancient forests where the towering pines whispered softly in the cool afternoon breeze, and the air carried the rich, damp scent of undisturbed earth. Leaving the familiar comforts of the riverbank behind, he stepped softly into a world where time was measured only by the slow arc of the sun and the gentle shifting of the shadows across the valley floor. In the deep, quiet isolation of the woods, he discovered the meticulous, grounding art of land surveying, a practice that required immense patience and a gentle, steady hand. He learned to work with careful precision, holding the heavy, cool brass of the compass and watching the delicate needle settle slowly toward the north. The work was wonderfully rhythmic and deeply meditative, consisting of long, quiet walks through the tall, swaying grasses, pulling the heavy metal surveyor's chain, link by link, across the soft, yielding soil. There was a profound sense of peace in this deliberate measuring of the earth, tracing the invisible contours of the land, while the gentle melodies of unseen birds echoed softly through the high branches above. He would stand perfectly still for long moments, peering carefully through the surveying instruments, breathing in the crisp, clean air, and feeling a deep, quiet harmony with the vast, ancient landscape that surrounded him. When the golden light of the afternoon slowly deepened into the rich, bruised purples of twilight, the surveying party would gently bring their daily labors to a close. They made their camp in small, sheltered clearings, building a solitary, crackling fire that cast a warm, comforting glow against the encroaching darkness of the ancient forest. As the evening softly settled over the valley, he would sit quietly by the gentle warmth of the flames, listening to the soothing, rhythmic chorus of crickets and the distant, lonely murmur of a hidden mountain stream. The nights in the wilderness were vast and completely unhurried, wrapped in a blanket of profound, restorative silence that seemed to wash away the complicated thoughts of the world left behind. He slept peacefully beneath a sprawling, velvet canopy of tents and stars, feeling the steady, deep, quiet harmony with the vast, ancient landscape that surrounded him. Rhythmic breathing of the earth beneath him, completely at home in the quiet isolation of the frontier. In the quiet moments before sleep claimed him, while the embers of the fire glowed softly in the darkness, the young surveyor would often bring out his journal to record the passing of the days. With a quiet, measured patience, he dipped his quill into the dark ink, the soft scratching of the feather against the heavy, coarse paper, blending seamlessly with the gentle whispers of the night wind. He wrote slowly and carefully, mapping not just the physical boundaries of the soil, but capturing the quiet essence of the untouched valleys, the winding paths of the peaceful rivers, and the towering silhouettes of the mountains. This nightly ritual of quiet reflection became a comforting anchor for him, a peaceful space where he could organize his thoughts and gently document his growing connection to the vast, open spaces of the American wilderness. The profound peace he found in this meticulous work soon blossomed into a quiet, lifelong calling, and before long, he was officially appointed as the surveyor for the distant, sprawling lands of Culpeper County. For the next 3 years, he wandered softly through the backcountry, sometimes traveling with a small, quiet crew, but often moving completely alone through the deep, solitary embrace of the forest. The gentle independence of this life suited his quiet nature perfectly, allowing him to spend his days tracing the edges of quiet meadows and charting the courses of slow, meandering creeks. He moved in harmony with the gentle turning of the seasons, watching the bright, vibrant greens of summer slowly fade into the warm, golden ambers of the autumn woods, and feeling the soft, crisp chill of winter air settling peacefully over the sleeping land. As he rode further into the uncharted territories, the landscape opened up into sweeping, majestic valleys where wild horses grazed peacefully in the morning mist. He learned to navigate the winding, shallow crossings of the Shenandoah River, the cool water rushing softly around his horse's legs as they waded through the gentle currents. There were days when he saw no other human soul, completely enveloped by the quiet majesty of nature and the slow, drifting passage of white clouds across the endless blue sky. This deep, unbroken solitude did not make him feel lonely, but rather provided a profound, soothing comfort, a quiet reassurance that beneath the noise of society, the earth remained steady, patient, and eternally at rest. Through these long, quiet journeys, the young man slowly accumulated a deep, intimate wisdom of the natural world, understanding the land not just as soil and stone, but as a living, breathing companion. He learned the quiet patience required to endure gentle spring rains, finding shelter beneath the thick, protective canopy of ancient oaks while the water drummed softly against the leaves above. He observed the quiet, steady endurance of the natural world, a gentle resilience that would gradually weave itself into the very fabric of his own character. As he slowly gathered his own small parcels of land, he was not simply building a livelihood, but carefully cultivating a quiet, deeply rooted sanctuary, preparing his spirit for the long, unwritten chapters of his life, while resting peacefully in the timeless, comforting shadow of the great mountains. As the quiet years of his early surveying days gently faded into the mist of memory, the vast, uncharted wilderness of the Ohio Valley slowly began to call to him once more. In the deeply freezing winter of 1753, the young man was asked to carry a message far across the towering, snow-covered peaks of the Allegheny Mountains. He wrapped himself tightly in a heavy wool cloak, riding slowly into a profound and silent landscape where the heavy branches of ancient pines bowed softly under the weight of freshly fallen snow. The journey was not a rapid march, but a slow, rhythmic passage through a deeply sleeping world. The only sounds were the soft, muffled crunch of his horse's hooves sinking into the deep drifts, and the gentle, ghostly whistle of the bitter winter wind moving through the frozen valleys. He rode for miles, enveloped in a pristine white quiet, his breath rising in slow, rhythmic clouds of frost that vanished instantly into the cold, crisp air. The elements tested him with a quiet, relentless persistence, completely indifferent to the warm blood rushing through his veins. He navigated across frozen, winding rivers where the dark, icy water slipped slowly beneath heavy sheets of cracked ice, feeling the profound chill of the frontier seeping deeply into his bones. There was a long, solitary night spent stranded on a small, quiet island in the middle of the freezing Allegheny River, where he huddled close to the damp, unforgiving earth without the comforting warmth of a campfire. As the stars wheeled slowly across the vast black canvas of the winter sky, he waited patiently for the slow, miraculous arrival of dawn, learning a deep, unspoken resilience that could only be taught by the harsh, quiet isolation of the natural world. When the pale, golden morning light finally broke across the icy horizon, he simply gathered his damp, frozen clothes and continued his slow journey homeward, carrying with him the solemn, heavy wisdom of survival. The seasons turned their slow circle, and the quiet surveyor soon found himself wearing the heavy uniform of a colonial officer, leading a small, quiet band of men back into the deep shadows of the forest. In the warm, damp summer of 1754, he found himself resting in a low, marshy clearing known as the Great Meadows, listening to the steady, rhythmic drumming of heavy rain against the bright green leaves. When the distant, muffled echoes of conflict finally reached his small wooden palisade, they were softened and gently drowned out by the relentless, heavy downpour of the storm. There was no grand, glorious victory in the mud of that valley, only the quiet, sobering reality of exhaustion and the gentle, inevitable surrender to overwhelming forces. He marched his tired men slowly back toward the familiar warmth of Virginia, walking silently through the dripping, rain-soaked woods, absorbing the quiet, grounding lessons of humility and the deep, heavy burden of command. The following year, he rode once more into the ancient, shadowy depths of the wilderness, this time alongside a vast, slow-moving column of seasoned soldiers. They marched with a deliberate, rhythmic pace, cutting a long, quiet path through the incredibly dense and towering trees, surrounded by the heavy, fragrant scent of damp earth, leather, and crushed pine needles. When the deep shadows of the forest finally erupted into the tragic chaos of the Monongahela, the memories of that day would forever remain in his mind as distant, muffled echoes, softened by the drifting smoke and the profound, sweeping silence of the deep woods that eventually swallowed the conflict. He rode steadily through the hazy, mist-filled aftermath, a quiet, solitary figure moving gracefully on horseback, while the world seemed to unravel around him. In the solemn, hushed days that followed, he helped guide the weary survivors back through the quiet, watchful mountains, his heart heavy with the solemn sorrow of loss, yet anchored by an unbreakable, quiet endurance. For the next 3 long years, the heavy mantle of leadership settled softly but firmly upon his young shoulders as he was tasked with guarding the vast, sprawling borders of the Virginia frontier. His days were spent in constant slow motion, riding for countless miles through deep, foggy valleys and quiet, isolated settlements that seemed to rest delicately on the very edge of the known world. The heavy responsibility aged him gently, carving deep, thoughtful lines of quiet wisdom into his face as he learned to stretch his meager resources and care for the tired, hungry men who looked to him for guidance. When the long, lonely nights settled over the frontier forts, he would sit quietly by the dim, flickering light of a single candle, writing long, thoughtful letters to the distant government, his quill scratching softly against the heavy paper while the cold mountain wind whispered gently through the wooden palisades, blending with the faint scent of wood smoke drifting from the quiet camps. The long, drawn-out conflict slowly and quietly drew to a close in the late autumn of 1758, ending not in a deafening crescendo, but in a soft, fading whisper. As his troops finally arrived at the distant contested forks of the Ohio River, they found the enemy had already quietly departed, leaving behind only the soft, drifting smoke of their abandoned fort, mingling with the cool, gray mist of the November morning. The vast, sprawling wilderness was finally completely quiet again, returning to its ancient, undisturbed slumber. Feeling the profound weight of the past 5 years slowly lifting from his tired shoulders, the young commander gently laid down his military commission. He turned his horse slowly toward the east, riding peacefully away from the deep, shadowy forests and the heavy burdens of war. He was a different man now, older, quieter, and carrying the profound, silent wisdom of a survivor, yearning only for the comforting warmth of a hearth and the familiar, gentle currents of the Potomac River waiting to welcome him home. As the heavy, lingering shadows of the frontier slowly melted away behind him, the weary young commander finally found himself riding back into the warm, familiar embrace of the Virginia Tidewater. The deep, quiet longing he had harbored for so long during the cold, solitary nights in the wilderness was finally coming to fruition, gently guiding his horse along the winding dirt paths that led homeward. He had laid down his sword and stepped away from the heavy burdens of military life, seeking nothing more than the profound, healing stillness of a life intimately connected to the soil. Returning to the peaceful, sweeping grounds of Mount Vernon, he felt a profound sense of grounding, a gentle anchoring of his spirit as he looked out over the slow, eternal currents of the Potomac River. The estate, which had come into his care after the quiet passing of his brother's family, stood waiting in the soft, golden light of the afternoon, offering a tranquil sanctuary where he could slowly begin to weave the threads of a new, peaceful existence. It was during this gentle season of renewal that his life was softly transformed by a deeply comforting, grounding presence. In the warm, fragrant spring of 1758, he was introduced to Martha Custis, a young widow whose quiet strength and warm, practical nature beautifully mirrored his own. Their courtship was not marked by loud, dramatic declarations or frantic urgency, but rather unfolded slowly and gracefully, like a delicate flower opening to the morning sun. Martha was a woman of immense warmth and quiet intelligence, bringing with her a soothing, steady companionship that the young veteran had never truly known. They found in each other a profound, restful partnership, built upon a foundation of deep, mutual respect and a shared desire for the simple, enduring comforts of home. As the cold winds of winter gently settled over the colonial landscape, they were quietly married in a warm, candlelit room on a peaceful January morning, joining their lives together as the soft, gray light of the season blanketed the sleeping earth outside. When the new couple finally traveled back to the quiet sanctuary of Mount Vernon, they did not arrive alone, but brought with them the joyful, comforting sounds of a new family. Martha's two young children, affectionately known as Jackie and Patsy, filled the once quiet halls with the gentle, rhythmic patter of small feet and the soft, echoing melodies of childhood laughter. For the quiet man who had never fathered children of his own, stepping into the role of a devoted, gentle stepfather became one of the greatest and most fulfilling joys of his life. He guided them with a warm, patient hand, finding immense comfort in the slow, daily routines of family life, ensuring their days were filled with gentle learning and quiet affection. Fading light of the evening, the family would gather together in the cozy parlor, surrounded by the faint, sweet scent of beeswax candles and the soothing, rhythmic ticking of the tall grandfather clock, while the warm glow of the hearth fire cast long, dancing shadows against the paneled walls. As the peaceful years slowly rolled forward, the modest wooden house on the bluff began to gently grow and expand, reflecting the deep, steady roots the family was putting down into the Virginia soil. With meticulous, unhurried care, he slowly transformed Mount Vernon into a sweeping, beautiful estate, drawing up careful plans by the soft light of a single lamp while the house slept peacefully around him. He oversaw the slow, deliberate addition of wide, welcoming rooms and elegant porticos, creating spaces designed not for loud, boastful displays, but for warm, generous hospitality. The grounds were carefully cultivated into rolling, peaceful lawns and deeply shaded groves, where ancient trees draped their heavy branches over winding gravel paths. He planted sprawling orchards that bloomed softly in the spring, filling the gentle breezes with the incredibly sweet, delicate scent of apple and cherry blossoms, creating a fragrant, living canopy that sheltered the home from the noise of the outside world. Yet beyond the comforting walls of the beautiful mansion, his heart remained profoundly tied to the vast, open fields and the rich, dark soil of his farms. He was, at his very core, a farmer who found his deepest spiritual peace in the slow, eternal rhythms of planting and harvesting. He spent his days riding slowly across his lands, feeling the warm morning sun on his shoulders as he carefully inspected the young, fragile shoots pushing their way through the damp earth. With a quiet, patient wisdom, he began to slowly transition his fields away from the exhausting, heavy demands of tobacco, experimenting gently with diverse crops and careful rotations to heal and nourish the soil. He planted vast, rolling fields of wheat, watching with quiet satisfaction as the tall, slender stalks swayed rhythmically in the warm summer breeze, transforming the landscape into a deep, rippling ocean of green and gold. The meticulous care he devoted to his land was beautifully mirrored in the quiet, solitary hours he spent in his study. When the heavy golden sun finally dipped below the distant tree line, he would often retreat to the quiet sanctuary of his personal library. There, surrounded by the faint, comforting scent of old paper and worn leather bindings, he would open his thick, heavy agricultural ledgers. With a slow, deliberate hand, he recorded the quiet poetry of a farmer's life, noting the gentle arrival of the first spring frost, the slow accumulation of a gentle autumn rain, and the precise measurements of seeds sown in the rich, loamy earth.
The soft scratching of his quill against the heavy, textured paper
Was a deeply meditative sound, a quiet nightly ritual that grounded him profoundly in the beautiful, cyclical nature of the natural world. As the wheel of the year turned, he found immense beauty in the slow, graceful transition of the Virginia seasons. He cherished the deep, silent blanket of winter, when the sprawling fields rested quietly under a heavy, undisturbed layer of pure white snow, and the world seemed to hold its breath in peaceful slumber. During these cold, quiet months, the life of the plantation drew inward, centered warmly around the massive, crackling hearths that filled the rooms with a deeply comforting, smoky fragrance. Then, as the icy grip of winter slowly relented, he would walk out into the softening earth, breathing in the incredibly rich, damp scent of the thawing soil, feeling the pliant, miraculous promise of rebirth that arrived with the gentle spring rains. Every season brought its own slow, reassuring rhythm, a steady, unbroken cadence that lulled his spirit into a profound and abiding peace. This beautiful period of his life, stretching gently across 16 peaceful years, was a time of profound, restorative stillness, remembered later as the happiest era he would ever know. He moved in perfect harmony with the turning of the earth, his days governed not by the urgent ringing of bells or the heavy demands of state, but by the soft, natural transitions of dawn and dusk. He spent long, quiet afternoons walking through the shaded gardens with Martha, the gentle rustle of her silk dress blending softly with the whispering leaves of the ancient oaks. They welcomed weary travelers and old friends to their table, sharing warm, leisurely meals filled with soft conversation and the comforting clinking of fine china, before retiring to the quiet porch to watch the slow, majestic flow of the river beneath the starlit sky. These 16 years slowly wove themselves into the deepest, most comforting chapter of his existence. It was an idyllic, profoundly beautiful passage of time, where the heavy burdens of his youth were entirely washed away by the gentle, lapping waters of the Potomac. He was completely content to remain quietly in the protective shade of his own trees, finding absolute fulfillment in the soft, loving gaze of his wife, the joyful growth of his children, and the silent, enduring strength of the land he nurtured. As he stood on the wide, sweeping piazza in the fading twilight, listening to the lonely, distant call of a night bird echoing softly across the water, he believed with all his heart that this profound, beautiful silence would last forever, gently carrying him through all the remaining days of his life. As the golden, peaceful years drifted softly over the expansive grounds of Mount Vernon, a distant, quiet shift began to stir across the calm waters of the colonies. Far across the rolling ocean, an empire was slowly tightening its heavy grip, sending ripples of unease that gently washed up against the quiet shores of Virginia. The profound stillness of the plantation was gradually interrupted by the arrival of letters carrying heavy news, their thick parchment whispering softly of new taxes and growing frustrations in the distant northern cities. Yet in the warm, candlelit study overlooking the dark, moving river, there was no sudden outrage or loud clamor for conflict. Instead, there were only long, thoughtful evenings spent by the fading embers of the hearth, where the quiet farmer read through the gathering shadows, feeling a slow, profound sorrow for the changing tide of the world he loved so deeply. In the quiet, wood-paneled rooms of the Virginia legislature, men gathered softly to speak of ancient rights and the heavy burdens of an encroaching government. He sat among them, a tall, silent presence, listening intently as the soft murmurs of debate drifted through the warm, humid air of Williamsburg. He was not a man of fiery speeches or dramatic, sweeping words, but a deeply grounded thinker who measured his thoughts as carefully as he had once measured the vast, untamed valleys of the frontier. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm and steady, anchored in a profound belief that a man's property and quiet independence were sacred, gentle rights that ought to be preserved. The slow, inevitable turning of the political season weighed heavily on his shoulders, an unwelcome but unavoidable reality, gently pulling him away from the comforting shade of his own trees. As the quiet autumn leaves began to fall softly across the Virginia countryside, painting the hills in deep shades of gold and crimson, he found himself preparing for a long, reflective journey northward. The colonies were calling for a gentle gathering of minds in the distant city of Philadelphia, seeking a quiet unity in the face of an uncertain future. He packed his heavy traveling trunk slowly, standing on the wide piazza and watching the warm, familiar light of Mount Vernon fade into the evening mist, holding tightly to the comforting thought of a swift return. The carriage ride was a long, meditative passage over deeply rutted dirt roads, moving rhythmically through quiet, sleeping forests and small, peaceful towns where the people looked to him with quiet, unspoken hope. When he finally arrived on the quiet cobblestone streets of Philadelphia, the air was crisp and cool, a gentle dusting of winter snow beginning to settle softly on the rooftops, while the faint, comforting scent of wood smoke drifted from countless chimneys under a vast gray sky. The turning of the year brought a deeper, more solemn stillness, and when the gentle warmth of spring finally arrived, the heavy clouds of conflict had softly broken over the northern horizon. Returning once more to the quiet meeting halls of Philadelphia, he carried with him the solemn realization that words and petitions had slowly run their gentle course. In a deeply symbolic and profoundly quiet gesture, he attended the daily gatherings wearing the familiar, slightly faded blue and buff uniform of his youth. The very same coat he had worn while riding through the deep, misty shadows of the frontier. He did not wear it to demand attention or to boast of his past, but as a quiet, visual promise to his countrymen. It was a gentle offering of his steady hands and his enduring silent strength, resting quietly in the corner of the room, patiently waiting to serve if the long, difficult road ahead required it. Within the warm, quietly bustling halls of the State House, as the soft light of a June afternoon filtered beautifully through the tall paned windows, the gathering of men looked around the room in search of a guiding hand. A quiet voice from Massachusetts rose above the gentle hum of conversation, proposing the tall, steadfast Virginian to take command of a new, untried army. The room settled into a profound, respectful hush as the heavy weight of the moment fell softly upon him. He did not accept this immense responsibility with pride or eager ambition, but rather with a deep, humbling sense of inadequacy, stepping quietly out of the room for a moment to collect his thoughts. When he accepted the commission, he did so with a quiet grace, confessing that he did not believe himself equal to the immense task. He asked for no grand salary, refusing compensation out of a pure, quiet devotion to the cause, seeking only to serve his home and return to it as soon as the long, dark clouds had finally cleared. In the lonely, peaceful hours of the night, as the rest of the city slept quietly beneath a beautiful blanket of pale stars, he sat alone by the dim, flickering light of a single candle. With a slow, heavy heart, he dipped his quill into the dark ink, writing a deeply tender letter to his beloved Martha, waiting patiently back in the comforting warmth of Virginia. He wrote softly of his deep reluctance, explaining how he had tried with all his gentle power to avoid this heavy mantle, but that the quiet, insistent call of duty could simply not be ignored. The scratching of his pen across the heavy paper was a sorrowful, melodic whisper in the quiet room, a gentle farewell to the peaceful, idyllic life they had so carefully cultivated together. As the first pale light of dawn began to gently touch the horizon, he sealed the letter, silently embracing the immense, unspoken burden of a young nation, and rode slowly northward into the misty morning, guided only by the quiet compass of his enduring spirit. As the heavy, solemn mantle of command settled softly upon his shoulders, the familiar nature of his world shifted gently from the warm, sunlit fields of the Virginia Tidewater to the vast, deeply snow-covered landscapes of a long and difficult struggle. The long war that slowly unfolded over the following years was not simply a matter of grand, sweeping movements across a map or the loud clashing of empires, but rather a remarkably slow, quiet test of human endurance. The colonial army he led was a fragile, weary gathering of quiet men who had left behind their own peaceful farms and dusty workshops, stepping bravely out into the biting, relentless chill of the northern winters. For months on end, they marched slowly and deliberately through deep, unbroken drifts of heavy snow, their tired footsteps leaving a long, silent, winding trail across the deeply sleeping earth. They navigated across dark, winding rivers where heavy, frozen sheets of ice groaned and shifted slowly in the dark, freezing currents, crossing the icy waters in the absolute, profound stillness of the deep winter night. Through all of this immense, quiet hardship, he rode softly beside them, a steady, deeply reassuring, and unwavering presence, pulling his heavy, dark wool cloak tightly against the bitter wind, while the soft, rhythmic breathing of his horse sent pale, ghostly clouds of frost rising gently into the vast, starlit sky. When the incredibly harsh and unforgiving winter of 1777 finally descended completely over the weary colonies, the tired army found itself seeking a quiet refuge on a high, wooded plateau in Pennsylvania, a deeply isolated and peaceful place known simply as Valley Forge. The surrounding landscape was hauntingly beautiful, but profoundly indifferent, soon blanketed entirely in a thick, heavy layer of pure, pristine white snow that seemed to softly muffle the noises of the world and hold the entire ancient forest in a deep, suspended slumber. Here, far removed from the comforting warmth of a familiar colonial hearth, the men worked slowly and carefully to build small, simple log huts, the muffled, rhythmic thud of axes echoing softly through the towering pine trees as they gathered whatever timber they could find in the quiet woods. The cold was absolute and completely all-encompassing, seeping deeply into the damp, rough-hewn wood and the heavy, threadbare blankets that the men wrapped tightly around their shivering shoulders as the afternoon light faded softly into a bruised, purple dusk. Yet, within this freezing, desolate encampment, a profound sense of quiet, enduring resilience began to gently take root, nourished by the shared, silent endurance of thousands of men resting closely together beneath the vast, gray, and heavy canopy of the winter sky. Incredibly dark evenings slowly settled over the sprawling expanse of Valley Forge. The entire camp would become profoundly still, illuminated only by the faint, flickering glow of countless small, struggling fires fighting bravely against the deep, encroaching frost. The men huddled closely around these fragile, precious sources of warmth, holding their numb, weather-beaten hands out to the gentle, smoky embers, finding an immense, unspoken comfort in the quiet companionship of their fellow soldiers. Food was incredibly scarce, and the simple, meager meals of flour and water, baked softly over the open flames, were shared with a quiet, solemn gratitude that asked for nothing more than the strength to see another dawn. There were no loud complaints or boisterous, echoing songs to break the sacred silence of the freezing night. Only the soft, gentle rustling of the bitter winter wind moving through the barren, icy branches, and the occasional, lonely call of a night bird hunting silently in the distant, shadowed woods. It was a time of deep internal reflection, a profound season of waiting, where the true lasting strength of the army was forged not in the heat of conflict, but in the slow, patient, and beautiful endurance of an impossibly cold and difficult winter. Through all these incredibly long, dark months, their tall, quiet commander never once abandoned them to seek out the comfortable, warmly lit parlors of the distant, sheltered cities. He chose instead to remain firmly and quietly rooted in the freezing encampment, sharing their meager, tasteless rations and feeling the exact same bitter, biting chill that crept relentlessly into their humble, drafty cabins. He spent his days riding slowly and deliberately through the quiet, snow-packed paths of the sprawling camp, his large, gentle horse stepping carefully through the deep drifts, his very presence offering a deeply comforting, unspoken reassurance to the tired men who watched him pass. He did not give grand, sweeping speeches or demand loud, echoing cheers, but offered gentle, steady nods of quiet acknowledgement, looking into their tired, sunken eyes with a profound, fatherly compassion that spoke volumes in the silence. The soldiers knew, with a quiet, unwavering certainty, that the silent man leading them felt the heavy, sorrowful weight of their suffering deeply within his own heart. And this shared, quiet burden gently created an invisible, unbreakable bond that slowly transformed the weary gathering of farmers into a deeply united and enduring brotherhood. When the incredibly long, quiet nights finally enveloped the sleeping camp, and the weary men slipped softly into the healing, deeply restorative embrace of sleep, he would often retreat to the quiet, lonely solitude of his small, drafty stone quarters. Lighting a single fragile beeswax candle that cast a warm, golden, flickering pool of light against the heavy, pressing darkness, he would pull his thick wooden chair close to the small, uneven desk. With a slow, deliberate, and endless patience, he dipped his quill into the dark ink, which often threatened to freeze in its small glass well. Spending countless quiet hours writing long, incredibly thoughtful letters to the distant government. He wrote softly and persistently, gently pleading for the heavy wool blankets, warm leather shoes, and simple, nourishing provisions his devoted men so desperately needed to survive the freezing season. The quiet, rhythmic scratching of his pen against the heavy, textured paper became a deeply meditative, soothing sound in the otherwise silent room, a gentle, nightly ritual of profound care and unyielding devotion. He poured his quiet, steady strength into every carefully chosen word, carrying the immense, silent hopes of his entire army upon his weary shoulders, while the cold mountain wind whistled softly through the cracks in the wooden window frames, testing his quiet resolve, but never breaking his incredibly grounded and peaceful spirit. As the heavy frozen weeks gradually and beautifully folded into one another, the deep, unbroken grip of the long winter finally began to slowly, almost imperceptibly, loosen its heavy hold on the sleeping, frozen earth. The vast, blinding expanses of pure white snow began to recede gently, melting softly into the dark, incredibly thirsty soil, and filling the quiet, winding forest streams with the musical, rushing sound of clear, cold water tumbling over smooth stones. The days grew beautifully and steadily longer, the pale, distant winter sun gradually gaining a warm, golden, and deeply comforting strength that slowly coaxed the very first, delicate green shoots of spring to push their way bravely through the damp, softening mud. A profound, quiet sense of miraculous renewal washed softly over the rolling hills of Valley Forge, lifting the heavy, tired spirits of the men as they stepped out of their dark cabins to breathe in the incredibly sweet, rich, and fragrant scent of the thawing earth. The quiet army that eventually marched slowly out of that valley was entirely transformed, hardened not by the loud clash of weapons or the heavy demands of war, but by the quiet, miraculous endurance of the human spirit, ready to softly face the long, unwritten chapters of their gentle journey with a steady, peaceful, and unbreakable resolve. The long, heavy years of conflict finally began to draw to a quiet and gentle close. The distant, muffled echoes of the long struggle slowly faded away, replaced by a profound, settling stillness that swept gracefully across the weary, sprawling colonies. The great dark storms of the Revolution had completely passed, leaving behind a deep, peaceful quiet that allowed the drifting smoke to clear and the gentle, golden light of a new era to shine softly on the resting land. He had waited patiently through 8 incredibly long, difficult years for this profound moment of rest, holding his fragile, exhausted army together through the absolute darkest winters and the most trying, lonely seasons. Now, as the beautiful, crisp autumn of 1783 settled completely over the northern states, painting the deep, ancient forests in rich, warm shades of amber, rust, and gold, he knew with a quiet, deeply comforting certainty that his long, arduous task was finally complete. The time had come to gently lay down the incredibly heavy burdens of command, to step away from the loud, demanding noise of history, and to slowly begin the long, peaceful journey back to the quiet, familiar sanctuary of his cherished home. Before he could turn his horse southward toward the familiar, welcoming shores of Virginia, there was one final, deeply tender parting that weighed softly upon his resting heart. In the quiet, warmly lit rooms of France's Tavern in New York, as the early December twilight gathered peacefully outside the thick, frost-covered windows, he met for the very last time with the loyal, devoted officers who had stood steadfastly by his side through the long, freezing winters. The room was incredibly still, filled with a profound, unspoken reverence and the gentle, comforting warmth of a massive hearth fire that cast long, dancing shadows against the dark, wood-paneled walls. He raised a simple, delicate glass to the weary men who had shared his heaviest, most sorrowful burdens, his voice soft and trembling slightly with deep, genuine emotion as he wished them a long future filled with the exact same quiet peace they had fought so tirelessly to secure. With a slow, heavy heart overflowing with profound gratitude, he gently embraced each man in the quiet room, a deeply moving, tearful farewell that softly washed away the heavy, rigid titles of military rank, leaving behind only the pure, enduring, and beautiful bonds of a deeply forged brotherhood. Leaving the warm, comforting glow of the tavern behind, he stepped softly out into the crisp, deeply cold air of the winter evening, walking slowly toward the quiet harbor where a small wooden boat waited patiently to carry him gently across the dark, rippling water. His journey southward was completely unhurried, a slow, meditative, and beautifully rhythmic progression through small, rectangular towns, peaceful towns, and quiet, snow-dusted valleys where the local people gathered softly along the rural roads to simply watch him pass, offering gentle, silent nods of profound, unspoken gratitude. He rode steadily toward the quiet city of Annapolis, where the civilian government had gathered in a warm, candlelit chamber, waiting patiently for the final, concluding act of this incredibly long and difficult historical chapter. As he rode slowly through the deeply sleeping winter landscape, entirely enveloped in the heavy, comforting silence of the season, he felt the immense, invisible weight of his boundless authority beginning to slowly, naturally lift from his tired, sloping shoulders. Every steady, rhythmic step of his horse carried him further away from the complicated noise of the world and much closer to the profound, restorative quiet he had yearned for during so many lonely, freezing nights under the vast open sky. On a cool, gray morning, just 2 days before the arrival of Christmas, he walked softly into the quiet, expectant meeting hall of the Congress, his tall, deeply familiar frame moving with a slow, deliberate, and incredibly grounded grace. The large room was hushed in absolute, breathtaking silence, every single eye resting gently upon the quiet man who held the unquestioned, absolute devotion of an entire army, a man who could have so easily reached out and grasped the heavy, gilded reins of permanent power. Instead, with a profoundly peaceful and incredibly steady hand, he reached slowly into the dark woolen pocket of his coat and gently withdrew the folded, worn parchment of his original military commission. His voice was calm and incredibly soft as he finally spoke, his measured words echoing gently in the completely quiet room, offering his simple, warm congratulations to the assembly and formally, willingly returning the immense trust they had placed in his hands so many years ago. Placing the paper quietly on the smooth wooden table before them, he performed an act of letting go so profound and so beautifully simple that it seemed to cause the entire world to pause and take a long, deep breath of pure healing relief. Having gently surrendered his sword and stepping gracefully away from the bright center of the world's stage, he emerged from the quiet hall not as a conquering general or a demanding ruler, but simply as a quiet, weary farmer, longing deeply for the familiar, comforting shade of his own ancient trees. He climbed slowly into his waiting carriage, wrapping himself securely in a heavy woolen blanket against the gentle, biting winter chill, and began the final, incredibly beautiful leg of his long journey home. The Virginia countryside welcomed him with a profound, deeply sleeping stillness, the heavily rutted dirt roads winding softly through ancient, quiet forests that were completely blanketed in a pristine, untouched layer of pure white snow. As the gentle, golden light of Christmas Eve slowly faded into the rich, bruised purples and deep, velvety blues of the winter twilight, the familiar, sweeping curves of the Potomac River finally appeared through the dark, resting silhouettes of the towering oaks. The carriage rolled slowly up the winding gravel path to the beautiful, welcoming portico of Mount Vernon, where the soft, warm glow of candlelight spilled gently from the glass windows, and Martha stood quietly at the door, offering the absolute, perfect peace of a long journey that had finally, safely, and beautifully come to its resting end. For 4 quiet, deeply beautiful years, the weary general finally lived the peaceful life he had always so desperately wanted, moving in gentle harmony with the slow, eternal rhythms of his Virginia farms. But the quiet sanctuary of Mount Vernon could not forever shield him from the softly growing murmurs of a new nation struggling to find its steady footing. The loose bonds that held the distant colonies together were gently fraying, and once more the heavy, solemn call of duty echoed softly across the peaceful waters of the Potomac. In the warm, fragrant spring of 1787, he packed his traveling trunks with a slow, reluctant sigh, leaving behind the blooming orchards and the comforting shade of his ancient trees to journey northward once again. He arrived in the quiet, cobblestone streets of Philadelphia, where the finest minds of the continent had gathered in a warm, wood-paneled hall to carefully draft a new blueprint for their shared future. During those long, incredibly humid summer months, he sat quietly at the front of the room, presiding over the endless, murmuring debates with a profound, steady silence that anchored the room like a deeply rooted oak weathering a gentle passing storm. He spoke very little during those long, incredibly thoughtful sessions, preferring to listen patiently while the soft, rhythmic ticking of a tall grandfather clock measured out the passing hours. His very presence in the room provided a quiet, unspoken reassurance, a deeply comforting promise of stability as the men worked slowly and deliberately to lay the heavy, enduring stone foundations of a new government. When the heavy parchment was finally signed, leaving behind the rich, faint scent of drying ink and warm sealing wax, the quiet architect turned his carriage homeward, hoping that his long, arduous labor was truly finished. Yet, as the slow wheel of the year turned and the first gentle snows began to melt into the soft, welcoming earth, a new and profound realization settled quietly over the land. The people of the new nation, looking for a steady, guiding hand to lead them through the incredibly uncertain dawn, had unanimously chosen the quiet Virginia farmer to be their very first president. When the deeply reluctant news finally reached him, he accepted the immense, overwhelming responsibility not with eager pride, but with the quiet, heavy resignation of a man who simply could not refuse the gentle, pleading call of his home. His long, slow journey to the temporary capital in New York was marked by a profound, overwhelming outpouring of quiet gratitude from the people who lined the dusty, winding roads to watch his carriage pass. When he finally stood on the high balcony to softly take the oath of office in the gentle spring air of 1789, he chose to wear a simple, unassuming suit of brown American broadcloth, deliberately stepping away from the heavy gold lace and the loud, boastful pomp of European courts. He placed his large, weathered hand gently upon a thick, leather-bound Bible, his voice soft and slightly trembling as he solemnly promised to preserve and protect the fragile new world they had all built together. There were no gilded thrones or jeweled crowns waiting for him in the quiet, dimly lit rooms of his new office, only a heavy wooden desk and an endless, towering mountain of carefully folded letters and thick, rustling documents. He approached this entirely unmapped wilderness of governance with the exact same slow, incredibly patient deliberation he had once used to measure the vast, untouched valleys of the western frontier, knowing that every single quiet step he took would create a gentle path for all the generations that would eventually follow. The heavy, daily burdens of the presidency weighed softly but persistently upon his aging shoulders as he worked slowly to weave the fragile, distinct threads of the colonies into a single, enduring tapestry of peace. He surrounded himself with brilliant, incredibly thoughtful men, listening patiently to their quietly passionate debates while sitting comfortably by the warm, flickering glow of the hearth fire. He established deeply grounded traditions of quiet civility and gentle restraint, insisting on being addressed simply and respectfully, entirely refusing the grand, sweeping titles that others wished to place upon him. When the distant, incredibly loud drums of conflict began to beat once again across the vast ocean in Europe, threatening to pull the fragile young nation into another deeply exhausting war, he stood completely firm in his quiet resolve. With a slow, steady hand, he signed proclamations of absolute neutrality, carefully guiding his people away from the destructive noise of foreign entanglements, gently anchoring the ship of state in calm, peaceful waters, while the rest of the world raged softly in the distance. Yet, despite the profound, enduring success of his careful stewardship, his heart was never truly at rest in the busy, paved streets of the capital cities. During the long, quiet afternoons, when the pale winter sunlight filtered softly through the tall glass window panes of his office, he would often pause in his endless writing to gaze wistfully toward the southern horizon. He longed deeply for the incredibly sweet, damp scent of the freshly turned Virginia soil, the gentle, soothing melodies of the birds singing in his sprawling orchards, and the profound, unbroken silence of a misty morning on the peaceful banks of the river. When he had finally served 2 full, incredibly exhausting terms, slowly guiding the nation through its most fragile, formative years, he decided with a profound, unshakable certainty that it was finally time to rest. In the cool, fading autumn of 1796, he published a deeply tender and thoughtful farewell letter to the nation he loved so much, gently offering his final quiet words of fatherly guidance, and slowly stepping away from the heavy mantle of power to begin the incredibly beautiful, final journey back to the comforting shade of his own ancient trees. When the heavy wheels of his carriage finally turned onto the familiar, winding gravel path of Mount Vernon in the gentle spring of 1797, a profound, sweeping sense of relief washed quietly over him. The long, demanding journey of his public life had finally come to a peaceful end. He stepped softly down, breathing in the rich, damp scent of the Virginia soil, feeling the welcoming embrace of the southern breeze as it rustled gently through the towering oaks. The heavy burdens of the presidency and the weight of a nation's expectations simply melted away, replaced entirely by the restorative silence of his cherished home. Martha stood quietly on the sweeping piazza, her soft smile offering the perfect comfort of a deeply rooted partnership that had weathered the changing seasons of their long journey. He was exactly where he belonged, ready to spend his final years resting peacefully beneath the comforting shade of his own trees. His days slowly settled into a beautiful, unhurried rhythm, governed entirely by the gentle turning of the earth and the slow arc of the sun. Long before the first pale light of dawn touched the eastern horizon, while the rest of the world remained wrapped in a deep slumber, he would rise softly from his bed. He found a quiet joy in these solitary morning hours, lighting a single beeswax candle and walking slowly down the wooden halls. Saddling his horse in the cool, misty dawn, he rode out across the vast, rolling expanse of his 5 farms. He was an older man now, his hair completely white, his face weathered by decades of sun and heavy responsibility, but his grounded spirit felt incredibly light. He rode slowly through the damp fields, listening to the gentle thud of his horse's hooves against the soft earth, observing the miraculous growth of the new crops, and feeling an eternal connection to the timeless soil that sustained them all. When the warm sun reached its highest point, softly bathing the sweeping lawns in a rich light, he would slowly guide his horse back toward the welcoming shade of the mansion. The afternoons drifted by in a peaceful, leisurely haze, filled with the soothing murmur of conversation as old friends and distant travelers stopped quietly to pay their respects. Yet his favorite moments were always those spent in profound, comfortable silence with Martha. As the incredibly long shadows of late afternoon began to stretch softly across the vibrant green grass, they would sit together on the wide portico. They watched quietly as the sky slowly transformed into a breathtaking canvas of deep purples, warm ambers, and soft pinks, perfectly reflected in the steady, eternal currents of the Potomac River flowing peacefully below. The gentle rocking of their chairs and the sweet scent of blooming magnolias drifting on the evening breeze created a perfect, unbroken sanctuary of absolute peace. In the quiet hours of the night, when the house settled into a deep stillness, he would often retreat to the warm, comforting sanctuary of his private study. Surrounded by the familiar, soothing scents of old paper, worn leather bindings, and the gentle warmth of the dying hearth fire, he slowly began the meticulous work of putting his earthly affairs into peaceful order. With a deliberate hand, he dipped his quill into the dark ink, drafting his final will with the exact same quiet care he had once used to map the untouched wilderness. In these profoundly quiet pages, he made solemn arrangements for the future, ensuring Martha would be gently cared for, and setting forth personal instructions for the emancipation of his servants after his passing. It was a peaceful act of closure, a gentle tying of the final threads of an incredibly long life, softly preparing the ground for the generations that would eventually follow, while the rain drummed rhythmically against the glass panes. The seasons continued their slow, inevitable turning, and soon the deep, quiet chill of December settled softly over the sweeping Virginia landscape in the final year of the century. A pristine layer of pure white snow began to fall gently from the gray sky, covering the sleeping fields and the heavy branches of the trees in a profound blanket of absolute silence. True to the steady rhythms of his entire life, the old farmer rode out slowly into the cold, gentle winter rain to silently inspect his beloved land one last time. He moved gracefully through the hushed, deeply frozen world, enveloped entirely in the soothing, muffled quiet of the falling snow, finding immense comfort in the patient slumber of the earth. When he finally returned to the warm glow of the house, The winter cold had seeped softly into his chest, signaling with a quiet, undeniable certainty that his beautiful journey through the world was drawing to its gentle close. The illness that came upon him did not arrive with a sudden force, but rather as a slow, quiet fading of the evening light, a gentle transition from the waking world into a deep, eternal sleep. He rested peacefully in his comfortable bed, surrounded by the soft glow of flickering candlelight and the deep, unspoken love of Martha, who sat quietly by his side, holding his large, weathered hand. The attending physicians moved softly through the dim room, offering their gentle care. But the old general knew, with a profound, peaceful clarity, that his long watch had finally ended. He felt no fear, no urgency, and no regret, only a deep readiness to finally lay down his heavy burdens. Looking softly into the faces of those he loved so dearly, he offered his final gentle words, a profoundly simple whisper that drifted softly into the quiet room. "It is well." And with a slow, peaceful exhalation, he simply closed his eyes, slipping gracefully away, exactly like a gentle autumn leaf falling softly to the forest floor. There were no loud cannons or boastful monuments required to mark his passing in those first profoundly quiet days. He was gently carried by those who loved him down the winding, snow-covered path to the simple family vault resting peacefully on the wooded hillside. The immense nation he had so carefully guided slowly lowered its head in solemn gratitude, mourning the gentle passing of their steadfast father. But here, on the sweeping grounds of Mount Vernon, there was only the beautiful, eternal silence of the natural world he had so deeply cherished. The incredibly tall, ancient oaks stood quietly as solemn sentinels, their heavy branches reaching softly toward the vast sky, while the majestic river continued its slow, unbroken journey toward the distant sea. And so, the quiet architect of a nation rests, safely wrapped forever in the gentle embrace of the earth he so dearly loved.